Welcome back to Power and Politics. The Public Health Agency of Canada is set to release some new projections tomorrow about how COVID-19 could spread in this country. According to briefing notes seen by CBC News, the agency says we could see 60,000 new cases a day across the country by the end of December. That's if Canadians increase their contacts with other people, something Canadians fear could happen around the holidays. If the number of contacts, though, stays the same, then the number of cases projected could be closer to 20,000. And if Canadians reduce their contacts, then public health officials are projecting 10,000 new cases a day. And this is all, of course, by the end of December. To discuss these new projections and the state of COVID-19 across the country, let's turn to our primetime panel, Shakir Chambers and Kelly Kreiderman. And joining us for this part of the conversation, Raywat Deonandan, an epidemiologist and associate professor at the University of Ottawa. Welcome to the conversation, Professor. Great to have you with us. I wanted to start with you. Did anything in those projections seem off to you, or is it consistent with what you've been observing over the past, couple weeks?
The direction is certainly consistent. I mean, the thing about models is there's an old adage, they're all wrong, but some are useful. And this one's useful. It tells us the direction that we're heading in. The magnitude we can debate about. 60,000 seems kind of high, but something bad is going to happen if people behave the way we think they're going to behave over the Christmas holidays. And right now we're in the middle of exponential growth, so things are getting worse. So we should expect some kind of crisis in the next month. Again, we can debate what the magnitude of that crisis is going to be.
Is there time to, and I'll follow up with you before I bring in my colleagues, is there time to change that trajectory? I would note that in those projections it says, if you increase contacts, if you maintain contacts, or if you decrease contacts. I know it's been a real challenge right across the country to do so over the last month, but we are seeing kind of new restrictions in most places settle in over the past few days.
There's always time to change direction. When you're down a bad road, there's always time to turn around. The question is, how much good can you do with the time remaining? Extreme draconian restrictions will do some good. The question is, what will we tolerate? How much restriction can we actually stomach at this point? But something needs to be done.
Kelly, let me bring in you. We just talked to Rachel Notley, the leader of the NDP. We have requested and have done so for a number of days, Premier Kenney as well. The government there is certainly being criticized for, at this point, not going far enough, just based on the per capita numbers that we're seeing today. Alberta, for example, was reporting almost as many cases as Ontario. Ontario, of course, has a much larger population. Take the temperature for us, if you could, in Alberta. What is the sense that you have among the sort of appetite for greater restrictions or not?
Yeah, it's concerning, and it feels like it's getting more concerning by the minute. I think the big question now is whether we see Jason Kenney pivot. You talked about how he said he would reassess the situation in 2 weeks. That was 1 week ago. I know that there's a cabinet briefing this afternoon. I wonder, other provinces are setting mask mandates. They're doing lockdowns. Right now, we have restrictions in place that are similar to what Ontario had in September, when cases were much lower. And you have to wonder, with the pressure on the province's healthcare system, the number of ICU beds occupied, you have to wonder whether the government is going to pivot, whether during the briefing with Dr. Dina Hinshaw tomorrow even there will be news, or whether he will stick to his guns. This has been a government that has had a history of doubling down even when people think they will change direction. And I think it's a political test for Jason Kenney that involves many people's lives and livelihoods. But you have to wonder, has the test already passed? Has the moment to act already passed?
Shakir, speaking of pivoting, we are seeing some of that in Ontario, where a few weeks ago, Premier Ford sounded a lot more like Jason Kenney did at the time, and is now, talking pretty openly about the possibility of lockdowns. The information I have is that actually went before cabinet today, that there were recommendations put forward by public health for kind of reverting back to how things were in May. So closing down a lot of things like gyms, indoor dining, personal services, keeping retail capacity at 50%. It would be kind of regional. So looking at places like Toronto, Peel, York, things like that. But that is a big sort of move from what the premier was saying a few weeks ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the biggest question here is it's the frequency of the moves that Premier Ford has made. I think a lot of people in Ontario, they just want a leader who has a plan and who has certainty. I think what we've seen a lot with Premier Ford over the last little while, he would come out with a COVID response framework. Then a few days later, he'd make revisions based on a public pressure. Then Toronto wouldn't be happy with those revisions, so they'd add their own restrictions. And now we're moving to a point where potentially going into a lockdown. I think a lot of people see that and see the constant change and throw their hands up in the air and say, this guy has no plan. We're not going to listen anymore. And I think the biggest problem here is once people don't believe in the leadership and once people don't believe you have any plan, they start to ignore you. And if people start to ignore you during COVID, that's a dangerous path we're going down. So I think what folks want to see is just be definitive. Like Premier Palliser in Manitoba, cases started to rise. He went to a lockdown. I think people would appreciate if you just made your case, why are you going to do what you're going to do, give us the information, and just go for it. But the constant changing, I think a lot of people start to lose trust in leadership.
Professor, what's your impression of what may be contributing to, and I don't know if this is the right term, but what people are calling COVID fatigue? So sort of people not being as committed to the restrictions or the message even from politicians and from public health officials as they were, let's say, at the outset of this pandemic.
There's a few things going on. One is that they're not seeing body bags strewn across the street. This is not that kind of pandemic. It's not the bubonic plague. It's the kind of pandemic that affects our healthcare system. And if you're not currently accessing that system, you don't see the strain. So it's a conceptual epidemic, a conceptual emergency. And that's difficult for some people to take on in their intestines. And the second thing that's going on is we have to fight this parallel battle against misinformation and active disinformation. We're shouted at all the time about how this is a case-demic or a fraudulent epidemic. That's not the case, obviously. So I think people are intolerant of the restrictions and are feeling the fatigue because they do not perceive the seriousness of the situation. And that's a failing of us who are trying to communicate the nature of the emergency.
So I guess to that effect, just jumping off what you're saying, what do you think the implications are for people in the positions of communicating it? And I'm not necessarily talking about yourself like an expert, but specifically, politicians, as Shakir referenced, who have to communicate what those restrictions are and why they're enacting them, or public health officials who are trying to explain it. I find like part of the hard part is there's in some provinces there's a lack of transparency. Like you don't really understand because of minimal contact tracing where all the cases are coming from, what they're basing their decisions on. It sort of depends where you are, the level of transparency you get.
Oh, there's a paper written in 2007 about lessons learned about SARS. And number one amongst those lessons is be transparent with your messaging. And we were not transparent throughout the entire emergency. So we're experiencing a crisis of trust right now in our public health and political leaders. And a way to get back that trust is to be transparent with our failings and what we don't know. That's the only way to win people back.
Kelly, is there an issue of transparency in Alberta? I know Ms. Notley was saying that there isn't a lot. I remember watching, the Premier have 50 slides at the beginning of the pandemic. I've seen a lot less of that recently. What's your take on that?
Yeah, we don't have updated projections, which certainly from a reporting point of view, we would like to have. We would like to know what the government is expecting. In transparency, I think, again, the projections would be really important to have. The reasons why the government is making the decisions it is, why just the restaurant hours closures as a move as we see hospital capacity fill up. That was one of the markers that the government laid out as a point where they would take action. They took a limited amount of action. Why that action and not something more stringent? I think that's a big concern. At the same time, I think the pandemic fatigue issue is very real. I've seen a lot of resistance from both public health officials and politicians to enact anything strident. We only saw Dr. Bonnie Henry enact the mask rule today after saying she wouldn't. We still see that resistance in Alberta, and I think a large part of that is they're worried about doing some kind of wholesale rule on mask wearing, and there being some kind of larger pushback against mask wearing and other COVID rules. And I think that's also the balance that Jason Kenney's government is working with beyond his own personal philosophy on it.
Right. Shakir, I just have a few seconds left. Last word to you. You said it before, the communication stuff and the transparency is a big part of it.
Absolutely. And I would just say when you're trying to do what Jason Kenney and Premier Ford is trying to do, they're trying to balance the economy with health risk. You can't win because you'll never go far enough for public health professionals, and you'll also never do enough for entrepreneurs and small businesses. So they're in a lose-lose situation. The best you can do is be transparent, communicate why you're making these changes, and stick to the plan that you put in place.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much to all three of you for the discussion. Really appreciate your time. Thanks to Professor Raywat Deonandan and to our primetime panel, Kelly Kreiderman of the Globe and Mail and Shakir Chambers of Navigator. Power and Politics is back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us.